Chancellor Rachel Reeves, in fact, will fly off to Washington this week to try and negotiate this trade deal with the US administration, try and get that through before tariffs potentially return, even though the UK has negotiated that 10% blanket rate of tariffs. All countries around the world, or at least most of them, are trying to squeeze through a trade deal with the US before the 90-day pause comes to an end that President Trump imposed on the higher rates of tariffs that he brought in for some countries. What price are you willing to pay for that trade deal? What exactly are you willing to swallow, more relevantly? Chlorinated chicken, hormone-injected beef, these are both issues that have been highly controversial in a potential trade deal with the US. Nigel Farage has said over the weekend that he thinks it's worth allowing those products into the UK in order to get a trade deal with America. He says if British consumers don't want to eat them, well, they don't have to. In fact, he believes that farmers' markets are now allowing British consumers to be more discerning about their food and to go for locally sourced products, etc., etc., etc. Is it that simple, though? If chlorinated chicken gets into the food chain here, it'll get into all sorts of factories. It'll end up in chicken nuggets, won't it? And all sorts of other chicken products that we won't necessarily check the back of. It's not just going to be, the chicken breasts and thighs and things that you pick up in the supermarket where they're quite clearly labelled as either free range or, not free range, and maybe they'll be labelled as chlorinated or not. It's going to get into all sorts of different products, isn't it, that find their way into processed foods. Should we stand up to America on this one particular issue and say, no, we're not willing to do a trade deal if it comes with chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef? Or is the economic reality that we need a deal with America? And as Nigel Farage argues, we live in a free market where you can choose whether or not to buy it. You could check the back of every product you buy to make sure it doesn't contain all sorts of things you don't want to be in there. People already do that, don't they, with all sorts of things, whether it's organic foods or whether it's processed foods and they want to check for particular additives. Aren't we just being required to do what we always do and just check the produce for whether or not we want to buy it? Let me know what you think about the idea of swallowing chlorinated chicken as part of a trade deal or hormone-injected beef. 0345 6060 973. You can text me as well, 84850. Let's start this conversation with Tom Bradshaw, who's president of the National Farmers Union. We've also got Sir John Redwood on the line, who's, of course, a Conservative MP, former Single Market Minister and Shadow Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. In fact, I think, Sir John, you stood down at the election, didn't you? Have I just completely glossed over that?
I did indeed. I'm an independent commentator who follows tariffs and economies with great interest.
Thank you for clarifying that. So much happened at the election that it feels like I'm awash with of new MPs I still have to learn the names of, and indeed still mourning the loss of lots of MPs who left Parliament last time around. So, John, I want to start with you. Why should we allow chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef into the UK as part of a trade deal?
Well, because you don't have to buy it, and we have chlorinated water to wash our salads already, and nobody seems to get in a fuss about that. And if you don't like it, you don't buy it. And as to the question of what would be in processed food, then if a lot of people don't like any chlorine anywhere near to get rid of potential disease on their food, then the food manufacturers will put that claim on their package and say, no chlorinated chicken in this particular dish. So I can't see what the problem is. But of course we need a free trade deal with the United States of America. There's this huge opportunity. Donald Trump quite likes the United Kingdom. He's very pleased to have the state visit coming up. We should just give him a very good proposition. Why don't we offer to get rid of all the tariffs on American products into Britain, just as we've done with the European Union? And I think we get back a very good offer, which would increase the prosperity of both Britain and the United States.
OK, well, I can see Tom Bradshaw there shaking his head. And, of course, he represents farmers. He knows what's in their best interests. And it doesn't look, Tom, as if you think that chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef are in the best interests of British farmers.
Oh, look, I don't think they're in the best interest of British farmers, but I also don't think they're in the best interest of British consumers. A few weeks ago, I did a press conference with Lord Rooker, a Labour peer, who was ex-chairman of the Food Standards Agency, responsible for keeping our food safe in this country. And he highlighted that even after using the antimicrobial wash or the chlorine wash on the poultry in the US, 4% of US poultry, which is sold on the retail shelf, still has salmonella. Now, we don't want to open ourselves up to that sort of level of risk when we just don't need to. For over 30 years, we've decided that we're not going to use hormones in our livestock production. That is something that the UK citizen has decided they don't want to support. They don't want our animals reared in that way. And we have to think about, first of all, why are they using hormones? It's all about driving efficiency, but it's a product that we've decided we're not going to use. And then when it comes to the antimicrobial wash, or what has become totemic is the chlorine wash, it's all about the standards of production, which mean they have to use that chlorine wash. We don't have to use the chlorine wash because our standards of production are that much higher. And when we hear about labeling, the amount of time that a consumer has to make a buying decision is so finite that labeling really doesn't cut through in the way that it would need to be relied on as a risk. I mean, if everything was going to be wrapped in a hazard warning label saying that this is produced to standards which we can't produce to here in the UK, then maybe it would cut through. But we know that there's far too much detail already on the retail pack, and it wouldn't be able to get through to the consumer.
And so, John, part of the drive behind Brexit was to support British farmers, and we were told that, our trade deal with the EU, for example, was not advantageous to British farmers. Here are British farmers telling you they don't want chlorinated chicken, they don't want hormone-injected beef. Why aren't you standing up for them and saying, well, in a trade deal, just like we argue with Brexit, the most important thing is what our British farmers want?
Well, I do stand up for them, and I do use labels to buy British produce. I never buy continental food produce, for example, and I make sure that I buy the package which is easily recognisable, which usually has the Union flag on it. We accept much lower welfare standards in animal husbandry on the continent and import their product without any restriction. What we're talking about here is, shouldn't we allow the Americans to compete with the Irish, because we're at the moment importing huge quantities of Irish beef and Irish butter without the price competition and standards competition that America could bring to that marketplace.
Tom, again, shaking your head there.
Yeah, I mean, the standards of production in Ireland, they don't use any hormones. So they're very, very similar to our standards of production here, but very different to the US. And look, this isn't genuinely, it's not about protection. But the NFU have always said we stand for fair trade rather than free trade. And that means that the product being imported should be produced to the same standards that we expect our UK farmers to produce to here. We cannot undermine those standards of production and expect us to be able to continue to drive food security at a time of global insecurity.
So, John,
at a time of global insecurity, John, would be absolutely foolish.
Tom, hold on one sec. So, John, come back in.
Well, the EU standards are not the same as ours. If you take something like chicken, poultry, and yet you don't seem to object to that, I do think you have to trust the consumer, and there are an awful lot of us rooting for British farmers who are very critical of this government providing grants to stop you growing food and then taxing you out of existence.
But I just come back to this issue of Brexit, though, Sir John, as well, because that was the last major decision that Britain had to make about trade back in 2016, and then the deal that we had to negotiate with the EU. And we heard time and time again from your wing of the Conservative Party that this was about protecting British farmers, about fighting for the rights of British farmers. We were warned during the Brexit referendum campaign that if we did a free trade deal with America, it would involve chlorinated chicken, it might involve hormone-injected beef. And yet, here we are, 9 years later. That's exactly what is transpiring, that we're having to have these negotiations. British farmers are telling you they don't want this to happen, and you're saying, well, free trade means they have to put up with it. You didn't say that about our relationship with the EU at the time, did you?
Yeah, you're misconstruing what I said. Brexit was not about trade. Brexit was about taking back control to make our own decisions.
Yeah, because our trade relationship meant that we had to adhere to EU standards. That was part of the sovereignty argument.
Yes, but you didn't have to accept that deal. Indeed, I urged the government not to accept it because I thought it was a lousy deal. And I do think we need to have selective tariffs and bans on European products, just as we do on the rest of the world, and the same with America. And because you're entering negotiations with America, it doesn't mean you have to concede something that really matters. If enough people think that we mustn't ever have hormone beef coming into Britain, then we won't have hormone beef coming into Britain. It's as simple as that. But isn't it refreshing that we can have an argument here about what we want?
Tom?
Well, over 1 million British people supported our food standards campaign about not bringing in chlorinated chicken or hormone-treated beef. We believe that this government have got a very clear manifesto pledge that they are going to uphold the standard of domestic production. That is an absolute expectation from the farming industry, that we cannot be sold down the river again, expected to compete with that product, which is produced to standards we can't produce to here, which gives them an unfair economic advantage. Now, we've decided we want to have some of the highest animal health and welfare standards in the world as a country. We can't just undermine that to try and do a trade deal with anyone around the world. We have to look at how we, at a time of global insecurity, we need to be driving food production to deliver for food security and for society. And we won't do that if we take the cheapest option.